So this article was called The Economics of Identity and Conflict. And really it sought to explain how identity and conflict are related, and focused on kind of what we already know and what do we need to know yet about this relationship. So the author provides a summary of some existing research, theories, and information regarding conflict and identity. And he primarily looks at it through the lens of psychology, political science, and economics, where he also notes that the majority of this information, it comes from these three disciplines. So he first explains some of what we already know about what identity is, what conflict is, kind of how they're related. And then discusses some theoretical background and provides an overview of experimental and empirical studies that exist. And then what they show us about conflict and identity. So what he concludes is that there's definitely a relationship between conflict and identity. A lot of previous literature and studies surround that and kind of notate that. But he talks a lot about kind of where there's some where things don't really see eye to eye. For instance, he gives some experimental study reviews where the conclusions were vastly different. And so it does leave some questions yet to be answered on what we know about this field. A lot of what the overall takeaway is kind of lies actually in context. So in a conflict, the given factors at hand may shape that outcome to be very different from another one, just based off of how those things play into that specific region or that specific organization, et cetera. So better understanding the various variables can help us better understand how to prevent or resolve that conflict that is caused or exacerbated by identity. Any organization structure or conflict resolution specialist could benefit from better understanding this role of identity and conflict and how they're related, as well as understanding the full context of the situation that you're trying to resolve or prevent.
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of a central construct in almost a lot. I mean, I think a majority of conflict, right? There's at least some part of identity, and sometimes it's not even necessarily like a social category. It's just like even could be an identity of like I'm a leader or I'm an employee or something like that. It's just like, how does my identity play into the power dynamic here, and then how's that interacting with conflict? And I think, I mean, this is pretty intuitive that there's so many variables that interact with this relationship between conflict and identity. Certainly context dependent.
And one of the fascinating examples I thought was provided was actually on how you could take two groups, and if one of those was making a higher income, it could actually totally outside of the other factors that usually would have caused a conflict, like religion, it could actually be exacerbated by something as simple as who's doing better economically. And that was just his point of all these various factors, right? A lot of people might focus on those larger aspects, but then you have these smaller ones that kind of play into things as well, that kind of go under the radar. So I think it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, this reminds me of like some of my graduate studies. I took a whole course on conflict and identity, and I remember this one concept. It was another kind of research article, and I don't remember the author, but he talked about this notion of multiple allegiances and how we all have that, right? And those multiple parts of our identity, and so similar to kind of what this study is illustrating, that the conflict and identity are almost always linked, right? But what I remember kind of a key takeaway from that was that he was saying if someone cannot acknowledge that they have multiple allegiances, that's when conflict can kind of exacerbate and become more. So this is just like reminding me of that and making me kind of question how that plays a role. How if we don't acknowledge that we do have multiple parts of our identity and not just kind of holding on to the one that might be the superior group identity in the particular situation or whatnot, like what that can do to conflict and how that can kind of lead to more harm.
Yeah, and how I mean, and sometimes I mean identity not only sometimes can promote conflict, it can also promote peace. Like so, if we deconstruct identity, if we focus on common identity, uh, intersectional identities, multiple identities, and sometimes there's identity around conflict itself. So it's sort of like reflexive in some way where like conflict can emerge because of a number of variables including identity, and then people create identities around being in conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm this person in conflict, and it's like people get attached to that, and like who am I without the conflict now?
Yeah, so I that's a really interesting point too about how that can be part of our identity of just being in conflict. Like I want to identify as someone who is in conflict. That's interesting.
I don't know how many times do you deal with someone like like for instance like like working with a couple people at work that are in conflict, and I've seen this a few times where it's like one person's just like they don't know how to not be in conflict with this other person who they've been in conflict with for so long. They don't know how to even be at that company if they're not the person who's like fighting against the other. And sometimes they even resist leaving the organization because if they leave, then the other side won. So it means that some piece of their like personal narrative has been like shattered about, well, I'm the loser. I don't want to be the loser. I want to be the winner. So I can't leave. I can't leave the organization because I need to win. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. There's such a core mechanism in our psychologies that constructs identity.
Mm-hmm.
Makes me think of the negative identity too that we were talking about a week or two ago of holding identity just because you're not that other group kind of a thing. That kind of relates. I feel like the conflict identity might shift in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I'm sorry, I'm going back to this article who I don't know, and it's not this one that we're necessarily discussing, but this concept of like not acknowledging that we have multiple parts to our identity. We have multiple allegiances and how that could contribute, because it's like if you're in conflict and you're stuck in that one narrative that like what we're talking about now, I am in conflict and that's the identity that I want, that is salient right now, right? That's what I want to focus on as being the person in conflict. If you're not able to remember all those other parts of your identity and what role they're playing in it, whether they're being harmed, that those parts are being harmed, or those parts multiple of them might be the common ground that you could find with that other person. So if you're not able to kind of think beyond and acknowledge that there are multiple parts to your identity, then you're stuck there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then what happens when you recognize that you have different parts of your identity? So for example, like the way I am at church may not necessarily be the way I am at home, because there's just kind of different parts of me that are accepted in that environment. And then the way I am at home may not be the way I communicate and the way I am in the workplace. And then that might be separate from like the way I am on the tennis court. And so it's all me, but there are different parts of my identity that are useful or that fit in better in different environments. But if I'm not aware of that, and then if I'm not really good at kind of shedding or putting on the different identities for the correct environment, then that could cause inner conflict as well as interpersonal conflict.
Yeah.
And that's like, I think, an interesting point, Tony, because there's also, I think, almost in like numerous identities, even in like, take your workplace, for example. You might not only be one person in the workplace either, because your relationship with your coworkers or your supervisor or, different people could vary from being a friend or a colleague to, or a subordinate too. So there's just so much that oversees this idea of identity in various
It's both,
settings.
yeah, I mean, it's both, it's like both relationship dependent as well as like environment dependent. You know, so like in a particular environment plus in a particular relational dynamic. I think Tony, to speak to your point, like if you become aware, I think it's a good practice, and it's part of what we ought to be doing, especially in coaching, is to help people become aware of the different identities that are salient for them in each context, and what they feel like as, you know, a husband or a mother or whatever in that context, and then as a coworker or an employee or a leader in that context, and like helping them, and then noticing, like kind of like you said, Tony, they're useful in these different areas. But when you notice that one is actually not useful, it's not actually working for you anymore. Hey, you're in constant conflict at work. So maybe there's a way to like take some other piece that of your identity, like at home, like the way you are with your brother or something. Can you take some of that identity and kind of model it for the workplace with a coworker? I mean, can you use some of that? Because you know how to be a caring, open, kind of, you know, less intimidating person at home. Can you take some of that and do it at work? Because what you're doing at work's not working.
Mhm.
And I think that comes through, like, the way to do that would be knowing your team, right? Kind of like what this is alluding to, like knowing the unique situations and the factors at play, but also the unique people and like and the identities that make up
Yeah.
the whole, right? Because you're not going to know to bring that part of you in to the workplace unless someone else, like you're able to kind of find a mutual understanding or like a common ground with someone else. So you're not going to know to bring that part of you into work unless it's like triggered from someone else. And that comes through communication and team building and all of that.
But I think, I mean, the self-awareness part is where it has to start, and not just start and then be done, but it's constant. It's like constantly evaluating the effectiveness of your communication and the, you know, the productivity and the just, you know, the relationships, like constantly looking at it and then constantly asking yourself, you know, am I approaching this the right way? Are they understanding me? You know, is my point coming across? Are my work relationships, you know, mutually satisfying? Just constantly evaluating ourselves. And I mean, it's a lot of work, but I think we'd all be better for it.
Yeah. Well, it brings up an important variable of communication, because I think we tend to look at these two sort of main variables, identity and conflict. Identity being this sort of psychological construct, and conflict being this behavioral outcome. And how do we measure conflict and see this? But there's some maybe mediating variable in there that explains that relationship, and that mediating variable probably is communication style. And it's like, how does the identity that you're in this particular environment predict the type of communication style that you're using in that environment? And then how does that communication style predict the types of conflicts you're in? So it might be an interesting thing to look at too, is like, why are you in conflict in certain areas and not in others? Is it because you're communicating in different ways? And is that communication based on the kind of identity that you're holding in those different environments?
And then if you find that you're in conflict in all of your environments, well then.
Oh, communication style needs to change in everything.